She was supposed to be a political footnote. But when 26-year-old Caroline Leavitt unsealed the folder in Congress, Washington saw the most chilling intelligence breach in a decade. The hearing room inside the Barton Federal Hearing Hall was unremarkable in its layout, wood-paneled, stern, and familiar to most Americans only through news coverage. But on that spring morning, it brimmed with unease. The hearing was titled, Oversight Review of Information Protocols in Intelligence Committees. A dull name for what insiders suspected was a proxy war over credibility and narrative control between Republican and Democratic leadership. Seated behind a modest nameplate at the witness table was Caroline Leavitt. At 26, her resume read more like a resume draft, former White House Assistant Press Secretary, now Communications Director for Congresswoman Elise Stefanik. Youthful, poised, and impeccably dressed in a conservative blue suit, Leavitt had been written off by most of the room before she even spoke. She wasn't here as an expert. She was here, it was assumed, as a symbol, perhaps a pawn in a broader GOP media strategy. Across from her sat Congressman Adam Schiff, whose legacy as a lead impeachment prosecutor and longtime member of the House Intelligence Committee preceded him. Schiff's reputation was that of a meticulous tactician, known for needling witnesses with calmly delivered, withering precision. He leaned toward his microphone. "Miss Leavitt, your youth and inexperience are showing," he said, with a dismissive smirk. "You clearly don't understand how national security oversight actually works." It landed like a slap in a room conditioned to measured speech. A few Republican members glanced around, unsure whether to object. Leavitt didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly opened a leather portfolio in front of her. Inside were documents no one in that chamber knew existed, recently declassified, quietly authenticated, and potentially devastating. The attack had come as predicted. So had her moment. 3 days earlier, she had received authorization from the National Security Council under Directive 14 procedures to present a series of redacted intelligence documents. What they contained was not speculative. It was logged, investigated, stamped with the approval of career analysts and bipartisan officials. She asked the chair, Mike Turner, for permission to proceed. He hesitated, then gave a cautious nod. What unfolded next was not a political performance. It was, in the coldest bureaucratic sense, a procedural execution. One document detailed a May 2020 violation. Sensitive compartmented information had been electronically transferred outside secure channels, traced to Schiff's committee office. Another, from December 2021, connected classified intelligence leaks to a press report citing congressional sources. Schiff's name was mentioned by internal review analysts as having participated in the meeting hours before the leak occurred. What began as a patronizing dismissal had become something else entirely. A pattern. For a moment, no one moved. Not Schiff, whose hand hovered near the microphone, nor the Democratic staffers frantically refreshing email threads for guidance. The screen behind Caroline Leavitt flickered to life as she inserted the first document into the projector system, a security incident log with visible declassification stamps, bold headers, and enough redactions to signal gravity, yet not enough to obscure the names involved. "Mr. Chairman," she said calmly, "this record shows a breach of Section 4.1 of the Intelligence Committee's own security protocols, specifically, the unauthorized transmission of classified material to media contacts." The projected page bore a date, May 12, 2020. The listed recipient, a national reporter known for intelligence leaks. The origin point, an internal email chain routed through the House Intelligence Committee's server system. The name of the initiating office, Schiff, Democrat, California, Chairman. Reporters in the gallery leaned forward. The gallery's usual background buzz fell silent. Schiff's voice cut in taut. "Miss Leavitt, these documents, without full context, can present a misleading narrative. You're implying wrongdoing where there may be none." Leavitt didn't react. She simply pressed a button. The next slide appeared, an internal security review dated 6 weeks after the breach. Its language was blunt, an unusual tone for such documents. The breach had compromised sensitive collection operations, enforced premature withdrawal from ongoing foreign surveillance activities. The document cited the leak as originating from congressional activity. A quiet gasp came from someone near the back of the room. Representative Elise Stefanik, seated behind Leavitt, said nothing. Her presence itself was calculated, silent endorsement without contamination. Schiff, visibly rattled but composed, leaned into procedural objections. "Mr. Chairman, we have not had time to authenticate these materials. Chairman Turner responded without glancing up. The documents have been confirmed as declassified through proper channels. The committee will proceed. Leavitt continued. She introduced a December 2021 assessment detailing the consequences of an unsecured conversation in a congressional office, again, followed by a press leak citing unnamed committee sources. The resulting damage assessment from the National Security Agency forced the closure of an Eastern European surveillance operation involving human assets. No theatrics. No raised voice. Just page after page of precise, procedural catastrophe. The strategy was clear. Schiff had tried to frame her as ornamental, camera-ready but ultimately irrelevant. Instead, she had entered the chamber with evidence that suggested a repeated, systemic failure to safeguard classified information under his leadership. And perhaps worse, that failure had not resulted in sanctions, public review, or corrective measures. It had simply continued. Quietly. Repeatedly. Democratic members whispered urgently among themselves. One asked a staffer to retrieve a classified briefing binder. Schiff's own legislative director scribbled notes, so fast they tore the edge of the legal pad. And Caroline Leavitt sat still. Composed. As if she had expected all of this. Because, in fact, she had. When the committee reconvened after a 15-minute recess, the energy had changed. Not just in tone, but in posture. Members who had earlier slouched now leaned forward. Phones had been confiscated for the duration of the hearing. Several Democratic representatives were no longer in their seats, replaced quietly by aides or simply absent without explanation. Republican members, particularly those with military backgrounds, had returned with highlighters and legal pads. Chairman Mike Turner called the room to order. His voice was flatter than usual. The committee has confirmed the declassified status and authenticity of the documents presented by Ms. Leavitt. We will proceed under standard hearing protocol. Caroline Leavitt rose slightly in her chair and opened the final section of her portfolio. Mr. Chairman, she said evenly, to address concerns about cherry-picked incidents, I'd like to present an aggregated analysis prepared by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. She placed a thick packet into the projection tray. It displayed a graph, a single bar stretching far higher than the rest, labeled HPSCI, Chair, Representative Schiff, 2019 to 2022. 27 documented breaches. There was no narrative. No interpretation. Just a tall, black line standing alone above a dozen others. Leavitt pointed to the footnote. This report, declassified 3 days ago, concludes that these incidents were not isolated. It notes, quote, systemic irregularities in the handling of classified information by committee leadership, including patterns of dissemination to non-cleared personnel and press contacts. Congressman Schiff remained expressionless, but his hands were now under the table. When the second page appeared, correlating dates of committee briefings with media leaks citing anonymous Hill sources, the connections were unmistakable. 11 incidents. 11 articles. Each within 72 hours of a classified meeting chaired by Schiff. A murmur ran through the staffer's bench. Then silence again. Stefanik leaned forward for the first time. Miss Leavitt, is this analysis peer-reviewed or conducted internally? Leavitt didn't look at her. It was reviewed by analysts from both the NSA and the CIA, then approved by the NSC legal team. No political appointees were involved in the drafting. Schiff's microphone light blinked on. His voice came slow, deliberate. Mr. Chairman, I request that this committee remove these materials from public display until a full review of their provenance can be conducted. Leavitt didn't wait for Turner's response. She lifted a final page. I have here the signed declassification authorization from the Director of National Intelligence, appointed by the current administration and confirmed by a Democratic Senate. She held it in the air, seal forward. This is not partisan. It is procedural. Turner nodded slowly. The record will reflect that the documents remain confirmed. The committee will proceed. For the first time that morning, Schiff said nothing. The silence said everything. Outside the hearing room, the Capitol press corps scrambled. By the time Caroline Leavitt closed her portfolio, Politico and Axios had already pushed breaking news alerts. Declassified docs show pattern of leaks from House Intel Committee. Read 1. Another more restrained. Intel breach reports cited by GOP staffer sparked questions about oversight failures. Inside the chamber, Chairman Turner moved with uncharacteristic formality. This committee will convene a special closed session to examine the full contents of the presented documentation. Members are instructed not to discuss these materials publicly until further notice. But the hearing had already leaked, in every way that mattered. Reporters clustered in the hallway outside, shouting questions at departing members. Schiff exited quickly, flanked by 2 aides offering no comment. Representative Jim Himes quietly peeled off in another direction, ignoring the media entirely. But Stefanik lingered, long enough to deliver a single, clipped sentence into a hot mic. "This is not going away." Leavitt, as instructed, remained seated for 10 minutes after adjournment. A procedural buffer. She gathered her materials slowly, neatly, with the same care that had characterized her testimony. No fist pump. No smile. Just precision. Onlookers noted her restraint. By early afternoon, the headlines had gone national. CNN ran the story cautiously. Leaked intelligence reports raise oversight concerns. MSNBC hedged harder, focusing on the political framing of Leavitt's role. But the documents themselves, bearing declassification stamps, ODNI analysis, and names, were irrefutable. Fox News, meanwhile, led with a banner headline: "Schiff named in security breach reports." Within hours, pressure built. Speaker Mike Johnson announced the formation of a bipartisan investigative panel. Notably, he did not appoint bomb throwers to lead it. Instead, he tapped Representatives Mike Gallagher, Republican Wisconsin, and Jason Crow, Democrat Colorado, a Marine and an Army Ranger. The signal was clear: this was not to be spun into cable news fodder. It was serious. That evening, Schiff's office released a 2-sentence statement. "At no time have I ever knowingly mishandled classified information. I welcome any fair and impartial review." But the issue wasn't just about knowing mishandling. The documents described procedures, logs, and clearance discrepancies, not intent, but result. A senior intelligence official, speaking anonymously to the Washington Post, confirmed the analysis had circulated internally since late 2023. "The declassification caught us off guard," he admitted. "But yes, the pattern had been documented." Meanwhile, online reaction fractured along familiar lines. On the right, Leavitt was hailed as a patriot. On the left, skepticism held, but not uniformly. "If even half of this is accurate, it's a problem," tweeted a former Obama NSC staffer. "And it raises serious questions about oversight accountability." That night, Caroline Leavitt declined all television interviews. Her office released only a written statement. "This hearing was not about me. It was about enforcing the same security standards on everyone entrusted with classified information, regardless of title, tenure, or party affiliation." She ended with a line that would be repeated across media outlets for days. "When elected officials leak classified information to shape a narrative, they don't just break trust, they endanger lives." By the following morning, the air inside the Capitol complex had thickened with something quieter than scandal: dread. Congressional staffers whispered in elevators. Senior aides scheduled off-site meetings. A few committee members canceled public appearances altogether. The usual noise of legislative churn was there, but muted. Washington was waiting for the second shoe to drop. It came not from cable news, but from the Director of National Intelligence. At 9:13 a.m., the DNI's office released a formal statement confirming that the declassified materials presented by Caroline Leavitt had been authentic, internally corroborated, and reviewed through appropriate interagency channels. More importantly, the statement acknowledged that the underlying analysis, citing 27 separate breaches under Chairman Schiff's tenure, had previously been circulated among oversight entities but not disclosed publicly due to classification thresholds. That wording landed like an indictment. The implication was clear: not only had these breaches occurred, they had been known, just not acted upon. Within an hour, 7 Democratic members of Congress, primarily veterans and former intelligence officials, released a joint letter calling for a full congressional review. Their tone was measured but unmistakable. "Oversight requires credibility. Transparency requires courage. Our national security cannot afford the erosion of either." The House Ethics Committee convened a preliminary inquiry. Schiff's office issued no further statement. His longtime legislative director submitted a resignation letter, effective immediately. 2 more aides followed suit before noon. The press, once divided along party lines, began to converge. The Wall Street Journal reported the specifics of the May 2020 leak, citing a high-level NSA source who confirmed that the disclosure necessitated the shutdown of at least one signals collection program overseas. The Washington Post, previously implicated in one of the identified articles, published a guarded editorial acknowledging that, if patterns of narrative-driven leaks are substantiated, it represents a failure not of policy, but of discipline. In private, Democrats scrambled. Schiff, once a presumptive frontrunner in the California Senate race, saw 3 major donors withdraw support within 48 hours. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee declined to comment on whether it would continue financial backing. But the ripple effects didn't stop with Schiff. Staff across intelligence-related committees began reviewing protocols. A quiet advisory from the House Sergeant-at-Arms recommended a full audit of secure communication channels used by members and senior aides. Subcommittees on cybersecurity scheduled emergency briefings. By Friday, 2 other representatives, one Democrat, one Republican, had voluntarily recused themselves from intelligence briefings pending internal reviews of past disclosures. Caroline Leavitt, meanwhile, was nowhere to be seen. She declined interviews on all major networks and did not appear on Capitol Hill. A single photo emerged, her exiting a federal building in D.C., portfolio in hand, flanked by 2 aides. Her silence was not avoidance. It was strategy. And Washington had begun to realize she wasn't going away. By the end of the week, the story no longer belonged to Caroline Leavitt or Adam Schiff. It had metastasized, becoming a structural problem that Congress could no longer confine to a single committee or a single name. On Monday morning, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence met in a closed-door session. According to leaks that surfaced within hours, irony lost on no one, the meeting had been tense. Not over partisanship, but credibility. A mid-ranking Democrat reportedly asked, "How long were we expected to carry water for procedures we didn't even understand?" There was no recorded reply. Across town, the Director of National Intelligence briefed members of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Though not publicized, the meeting was confirmed by Senator Mark Warner's office. Afterward, Warner, typically careful with public statements, told a small press pool, "These aren't partisan issues. They're structural. They reflect real vulnerabilities we have not properly addressed." Behind closed doors, the briefing notes were starker. Intelligence community officials reportedly warned that the repeated leaks had degraded partner confidence and had imposed costs not yet visible to the public but already absorbed within operational budgets. In less diplomatic terms, allies had grown wary, and missions had been altered. Caroline Leavitt's documents had not caused the breaches. They had made them impossible to ignore. On Capitol Hill, momentum toward reform began to take shape. A bipartisan group of representatives introduced draft legislation, the Secure Oversight Act of 2025, which proposed mandatory logging of classified briefings, third-party audits of intelligence committees, and most controversially, the extension of whistleblower protections to intelligence officials reporting breaches by elected members. It was the last provision that drew the fiercest resistance. For decades, elected officials had operated under a legal insulation that shielded them from many forms of internal scrutiny. Staff could be investigated. Contractors could be prosecuted. But members of Congress enjoyed constitutional protections, speech and debate clauses, procedural immunity, and political deference. The Leavitt revelations had punctured that culture of untouchability. Media analysis pivoted accordingly. A CNN legal affairs panel called the proposed reforms unprecedented but overdue. On MSNBC, former ethics counsel Norm Eisen remarked that Leavitt didn't just present documents. She forced Congress to confront the idea that oversight of intelligence must also mean oversight of itself. Even Schiff's defenders began to shift their language. No longer outright denials, but appeals to fairness, due process, and caution against setting dangerous precedents. The irony was unavoidable. The very mechanisms Schiff had long championed in the name of transparency were now being considered as tools to investigate him. And still, Caroline Leavitt said almost nothing. On Thursday, her office released a short second statement. "Congress is not above the rules it sets. I hope this leads to lasting reforms, not just for this case, but for how we treat national security information, and the public trust that depends on it. No theatrics. No self-congratulation. Just posture, still, steady, and unchanging." The week ended with a press conference on the Capitol steps, not by Schiff, or Leavitt, or party leaders, but by a bipartisan coalition of House freshmen. One, a Democrat from Michigan, said plainly, "The age of assuming leaks are strategic and acceptable is over. We're all on notice now." The message was less about fear, more about consequence. 3 months later, the political media had largely moved on. But the institutions had not. The bipartisan investigative panel, once met with cautious skepticism, issued a 174-page report that confirmed, without dramatic prose or editorializing, the central claims presented by Caroline Leavitt. The findings were plain: 27 documented security breaches under the House Intelligence Committee's Democratic leadership between 2019 and 2022. Of those, at least 12 were traced to unauthorized media disclosures that mirrored classified content discussed in restricted briefings. The report did not accuse Schiff of criminal misconduct. It could not. The speech or debate clause shielded members from prosecution for statements made in the conduct of legislative duties. But it did recommend formal censure, internal sanction, and, most consequentially, structural reform. The recommendations landed differently this time. Within days, new committee rules were adopted. Member access to classified documents would now be logged, reviewed quarterly, and subject to retrospective audit by an independent internal body composed of cleared nonpartisan staff. Disclosures to the press, once tolerated under vague norms, now required documented review procedures. No exceptions. 3 members quietly withdrew from their intelligence assignments. Schiff was not among them, but his standing had changed. Donors never returned. His Senate campaign, once projected as a lock for California's jungle primary, suspended operations after polling dropped to 3rd place. But Leavitt, despite her central role, never returned to the spotlight. There was no book deal, no documentary, no celebratory tour. When asked by a national reporter why she declined Sunday shows after the hearing, her office responded simply. The documents spoke clearly. There's no need to speak over them. In September, she was appointed as communications director for a leading presidential campaign. The move was quiet but definitive. A year earlier, most political analysts would have described her as ambitious, telegenic, and likely capped at staffer level. But by the fall, she had joined the inner circle of a national campaign, entrusted not with messaging alone, but with discipline. A profile in Time magazine captured it succinctly. Washington is often reshaped not by the loudest voices, but by the ones that understand timing, process, and patience. Caroline Leavitt didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise her profile. She just brought documents. The final impact came not in headlines, but in what quietly stopped happening. Members, once casual with phrasing in closed briefings, became guarded. Intelligence staffers, often treated as background figures, found their assessments taken more seriously. And junior witnesses at hearings were no longer treated as decorative adversaries to be swatted aside for sport. A senior intelligence official, quoted anonymously in a retrospective analysis, put it plainly. The only reason any of this came to light is because someone in the room that day didn't believe she was allowed to speak. He tried to embarrass her. And she brought a flashlight. Leavitt never responded to that quote. She never had to. In Washington, the damage had been done. But so had something else. A correction. And the people who once dismissed her had learned the cost of underestimation, not with scandal, but with process. That was her legacy. And it had only just begun.